My next question comes from Kelly. Kelly asks very simply, can you explain 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 10? I have it pulled up here. I'll go ahead and read the verse, and then maybe you want to go read before or after. But this is what it says. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And I was talking about head coverings, a lot of cultural stuff going on here. As Paul's writing to the Corinthians. So what do you do with that verse? I'm curious because I can't remember what you've done.
Right, so I can't explain it. I have no idea.
Okay, I thought you might say that. I just thought maybe you had something deeper, but in the commentaries I went through, it was all over the place.
Yeah, it is all over the place. So there's a couple of things that we can be thinking about. Number one, the symbol of authority on her head is not how it actually reads. It says, for this reason, the woman ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. And so in the passage, it's talking about veiling. It's not talking about little doilies on your head. It's talking about veiling. And this was something that was common to the Jewish culture at this time. It had also been common to the Greek culture, which is where this is at, and even the Roman culture. They were in a period of time where people were starting to flout that whole thing. And so the idea of a veil carried kind of the same idea as a wedding ring. And so if you see a woman with a wedding ring, she's not available. And if you see a woman without a wedding ring, she is available. And so it kind of carried that connotation. And there were still places all over the Roman Empire where women, when they went out in public, they went out veiled. And the veil could be anything from basically a scarf that was over her head, but generally speaking, when you read the references at the time, the veil was something that went down over the top of the head and all the way down to the neck. And so sometimes it had to do with their robes, and so they would take part of the robes. The Greeks specifically would take part of their robes and they would bring it up over the top of their heads, talking about the ladies. And sometimes they would take that and wrap it around their face also. And so we have depictions of this.
Now, this is similar to the Middle East culture today type of thing, right?
Yeah, it is. And so when you're going through this passage and you're looking at what Paul has to say about this passage, it has to do with glorifying your head. And so at the beginning it says, verse 3, I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. And so it's talking about headship here. It's talking about authority in these passages. And it says, every man praying or prophesying having his head covered dishonors his head. And that could be talking about the Lord, or that can be talking about his own head, and it depends on where you go at it with this with the interpretive process, because the word head is just head in the passage. And so in this instance, head is pretty much just like it is in English. So your head could be talking about your head. It could be talking about the person who is over you. And pretty much all the way through here, you have this back and forth type of situation with it going between the actual head and the person over you. And so a man was to glorify Christ in his worship in the church. And so he was not to have his head covered, because man is made in the image of God. And it's one of the things that Paul says in this passage. He says, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, for that is one and the same as if her head were shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. And it's just talking about it. It's a disgrace in that instance. And it has to do with the fact that the woman's head in the situation is the man. It goes through and talks about, in verse 8, the man is not from woman, but woman from man, nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. And then it says, for this reason, woman ought to have authority on her head because of the angels. Okay, and so as you're going through the passage, it's talking about submission all the way through. And so again, when you're looking at this, it's kind of like a veil in that culture, and specifically in the Jewish culture, was almost one and the same as our situation where we wear wedding rings. Originally, wedding rings were something that only women wore. And it wasn't until the 20th century that men started wearing wedding rings. And it looks like what was happening here is some of the women in Corinth were one of two things. They were either going with the whole movement of women not to wear head coverings anymore. And so there was some of that going on in the Roman Empire and in Greece at the time. And so it would be kind of like, back in the 60s, women burning bras type of, I know that's a weird reference, but that was a thing back in the 60s. And so it could have been something along those lines, or it could have been along the lines of women feeling freedom because now everything's changed in the Christian church. In Jewish synagogues, women weren't allowed in the church. They were back in a back room basically, and they could oversee what was going on in the church. Usually it was up in a loft. And they could oversee what was going on in there, but only men were inside the synagogue, and men and boys, and 13 and over, basically. And so women weren't allowed in the services. Well, when the church starts, women are allowed in the services, and so there's a freedom that's there. And so it looks like some of these women may have been taking that freedom a little bit too far and flouting the culture. And so in the culture, what you're going to have for sure is the majority of the Roman Empire is veiling, and they're veiling as an act of modesty and as an act of a recognition that they were taken, that they were a married woman, and classically prostitutes did not go around with veils on. They were advertising the fact that they were available. And so you had that situation going on. And so most of the Roman culture, most of the Greek culture was still doing that. And so these women were flouting the culture at this point. And again, it would be like a lady deciding, and it could have been for all kinds of reasons. When you're back in 1 Corinthians 7, there are women. I was
going to mention that.
Yeah, there are women who are asking if they should get rid of their husbands because their husbands weren't believers. And so there could have been a situation where the women were coming into church and thinking that their relationship with their husband kind of got in the way of their relationship with Jesus, and so they didn't want to have that symbol of authority over their heads at that point. And so,
see, I think that explains a lot of the attitude of sexual relationships, still doing weird things mixed with idol temple worship, this culture they're coming out of, and Paul's trying to correct that attitude. And now when you're talking about the clothing, it fits the attitude of what's going on in the church in Corinth.
Exactly. And so basically what they're doing is flaunting the culture and flaunting the majority of the culture. And it's not like there weren't ladies walking around without veils on, but they were flaunting the majority of the culture, and Paul's telling them to stop it. It's a bad witness. And so again, if a lady, actually, if I saw a lady in my fellowship, I don't know that I would necessarily see this because I'm not usually looking for it. But if I noticed a lady that I knew was married, was coming into church and taking off her wedding ring, I'd be asking her, "What are you doing? Why would you do that?" And then she would give me her reasons, and her reasons would probably, in that instance, be along the same lines as this. And I would say to her, "That's not a really great idea. It's not a good thing to do." And so all through this, it's a picture of glorifying your head. And so the man is supposed to glorify Christ, and the woman is supposed to glorify the man. He goes on in the passage and lets you know that this isn't something that is like intrinsic to the genetics of the situation. He says in verse 11, although you have this whole picture of headship, so Christ is the head of the man is the head of the woman, and so on. He says in verse 11, nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. For as woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman, but all things are from God. Talking about the fact that originally in the creation, the man was created first, the woman came out of the man, and so forth. But every man since that point has come from a woman. And so you see this in the picture of submission everywhere where it's used in the New Testament. So famously in Ephesians chapter 5 in verse 22, it talks about the woman needs to submit to her husband, a wife needs to submit to her husband as to the Lord. But the previous verse talks about submitting one to another in the Lord. And so although there is a headship, although there is an authority structure, there's an equality there at the very same time. And so you have that. This whole thing with the angels.
Yeah, so all that's fairly simple to figure out. But
Right.
why for the angels?
Right. The angels, in Ephesians chapter 3, in verse 10, it talks about the church being kind of a school for the angels. And it says this. I'm going to start in verse 9. It says, and to make all see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the ages has been hidden in God, who created all things through Jesus Christ, to the intent that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places, according to the eternal purpose which he accomplished in Christ Jesus our Lord. And then he goes on and begins to speak about other things. And so the church is something that is witnessing to the angels. The principalities and powers in the heavenly places is talking about the angels. And later on in 1 Peter, it talks about the angels' desire to look into the things of salvation. The Jews had traditions that the angels were involved in the worship of the synagogue, that they were there with the believers in the synagogue, and that's obviously true. The Bible talks about the angel of the Lord encamps round about those who fear him, and so we have angels around us at all times, and so angels are under authority to the Father, and also obviously to the Son. And for example, when you look in Isaiah chapter 6 verse 2, it talks about the seraphs or the seraphim. And it talks about the fact that they have multiple sets of wings, and so with one set of wings they cover their feet, and with one set of wings they cover their face. Another set of wings they have over their heads, and it's the idea of humility, covering your feet, cover your face before the Lord. It's an idea of humility. It's the idea of honoring the Father, and so the angels honor the Father. The angels know what headship looks like, and when the church flouts that, whether it's man or woman, because both of them are spoken of in this passage, whether it's man or woman, when the church flouts that, it's a bad witness to the angels, because again, the manifold wisdom of God is being spoken through the church. It's kind of a wild thing, but we know that we're made out of dirt, and it looks like what God's doing with angels is look at what I can do with dirt. So I believe that that's most likely what's going on. When it says, for this reason, the woman ought to have authority on her head, or a symbol of authority on her head, we don't understand the culture that takes place here because we're not used to this. A veil is a symbol of authority. It's a symbol of submission, but it's also a symbol of authority, and it's the power of the woman. And so one of the things that I tell people when we go to Israel, when you go to Israel, you're going to run into Muslim women, and specifically usually Bedouins, who are completely veiled. They got the whole burqa going on. And so their face is veiled, only their eyes are showing, their head is veiled, and only their eyes are showing. And one of the things that you do not do in that culture is look a veiled woman in the eyes. And if you do, they will start yelling at you. They'll
Really?
chase you. Yeah. Throw things at you, and it's because you're defiling them. You're dishonoring them is what's happening.
Now, is that woman married or unmarried?
That woman would usually be married.
Yeah. So there's okay. So there's
Yeah.
a violation there.
Yeah, so there's a violation there. And in many cultures in the Middle East, you don't lock eyes with even a young woman who's walking down the street. You don't look them in the eyes, and it has to do with this whole thing of honoring a woman. You don't hit a woman. You don't look in her eyes. You don't stare at a veiled woman, and so it's that kind of thing. But again, it would be synonymous with taking off your ring when you went into worship.
All right, so
Not a
I'm just
not a
thinking
good
out loud here. That's going to be some tough dating situations when you can't look them in the eyes. Like, how do they even approach this? I know there's more arranged situations.
Yeah, at that point, you're courting, and so
Right, okay.
it's a woman that you don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even going down that road. Boop, coming back. Okay. Verse 10, you mentioned angels, but you mentioned the good angels.
Uh-huh.
I'm saying I hold this view, but there are some people that go, okay, because the whole Genesis 6 thing,
Right.
that we're not talking about the good, we could be talking about the bad angels.
And that's a possibility too. And
What do you think about that one?
well, Tertullian came up with that, and I don't know. I think it could be. It's a little bit of a stretch, but obviously you have angels in Genesis chapter 6 that left their first estate and cohabited with women and that whole thing. And so he could be talking about that.
And then last thing is that you know how we're going to be over angels?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this whole authority structure that they're going to basically be reversed as far as it goes now for power and authority.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of a teaching moment of you can see them watching them do this messed up authority and go,
Yeah, you're going to be over me.
exactly. And so it's kind of an order thing
Yeah.
that it could be alluding to. I know
that's what the Jews say caused the fall of Lucifer.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Not the veiling thing, but just you're going to put that over me.
yeah.
Yeah.
Not going to happen.
Him being the highest creation.
All right. Good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, moving on here. All right, you've been...
Yeah, all that to say, I don't know for sure.
It's a long answer for unknown.